On 100.9 WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Good morning, Rochester. You are listening to Evidence of Design here at 100.9 FM WXIR. My name is Jason Taylor, and I am your host of Evidence of Design, and I am joined today by my good friend and co-host, Matt Treadwell.
That's me.
What is going on, Matt?
Not a whole lot.
Not a whole lot. I like your, you can't see anything in radio here, but Matt's wearing a red headset with a red shirt, and it's reminds me of Christmas. It's very nice. Need some green.
It's almost Halloween.
It's almost Halloween, yes. It is. We are talking about something real spooky today, and that's politics, folks. Just kidding. We are talking about politics, but I'll stop doing the corny jokes here. And I do want to thank everyone for tuning in to WXIR, which is a good asset for the community here in Rochester and elsewhere. Of course, you can listen online at 1009wxir.com. On today's show of Evidence of Design, we are going to be talking about the candidates for the 25th Congressional District. That was the seat previously held by Louise Slaughter until her passing earlier this year. And the candidates for the 25th Congressional District who will be appearing on the November 6th ballot right around the corner is Joe Morelle, who was the leader of the New York State Assembly. He's from Irondequoit and a Democrat, and he is running against Dr. Jim Maxwell, who is a Republican and lives in East Rochester, I believe. But both, of course, are Monroe
He's
County
a
neurosurgeon
residents. Is he the head of neurosurgery, I think?
Yeah, the chief of neurosurgery at Rochester General Hospital. Mm-hmm. And so those two candidates will be facing off this November 6th to represent us at the federal level in the House of Representatives.
In Washington, D.C.
That's right. They'll become one of 435 members who will vote and have the power to potentially impeach Donald Trump if the House flips to the Democrats and pass a number of really important legislation and block legislation. So this is a big race. It's one of many races, and I think arguably that Joe Morelle is heavily favored to win. The seat has long been held by Louise Slaughter, who's a Democrat, and the polls have shown Joe Morelle in the lead. But Matt and I were here today to talk a little bit about the candidates and the positions they stand for. There was a debate held this week on the 25th of October, sponsored by WXXI and 13WAM and other organizations that held a debate between the two candidates, and we'll talk about their issues today. We just want to bring awareness to this particular race and delve into some of those issues.
Give some of our own impressions as well. Yeah,
so we think voting is very important. We've talked about it before on the show. If you're new to Evidence of Design, we talk about income and wealth inequality, why that's important, and what we should do to fix income and wealth inequality. And we would love to hear from you throughout the show today with your opinions as well. You can give us a call, 585-219-8889. You can email us, evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. And give us a call again, 585-219-8889.
We'd love to hear from you.
We would. And thanks for being here, everyone. Matt, are we ready to take it away?
We're ready.
Let's do it. And we are back from having a little bit of technical difficulties taken away. I guess I'll have to sing for everyone. Yeah, everyone turn down your volume. Well, let's try it again in a second. But let's jump right into the issues then. If you're tuning in again, we are talking today on Evidence of Design about the candidates for the 25th Congressional District, Joe Morelle versus Dr. Jim Maxwell. Matt, as we already mentioned, so one of the candidates, the Republican, Dr. Jim Maxwell, is the chief of neurosurgery at Rochester General Hospital. He's been practicing medicine for 35 years, and he's a lifelong resident of Monroe County. Born in Pittsburgh, he graduated from McQuaid Jesuit High School, and his main shtick, in my opinion, he's representing himself as an outside political candidate. So he's someone outside the political establishment. He's a non-establishment figure, which, of course, is quite popular in sort of the American psyche. We saw that a lot in 2016, and he is coming off as someone who wants to reform Washington.
Yeah, he made that statement in his opening. Well, he made that statement in his opening statement, which was that he was. He said he was very frustrated, I believe, with what he was seeing in Washington, but he didn't really have the time, or he didn't give himself the time to elaborate on what exactly it was that was frustrating him, at least in the beginning. he was cut off, it seemed, midway by Evan Dawson, because they were only given 60 seconds to give an opening statement. But yeah.
Yeah, it's something that you hear from politicians a lot, that frustrated with Washington. It's just this general thing that you can say. I'm a little concerned, I'm a little confused about how a Republican candidates can say that they're frustrated at Washington when Washington is controlled by Republicans in the judicial branch, in the legislative branch, and the executive branch. And so I'm just a little confused. And I would generally want to hear more about why Dr. Jim Maxwell said that he was frustrated with Washington. Is this something that you just say because voters, like every single election ever, every single politician ever says we want change, right? That's just something you say because it's universally applicable to everyone. No one is like, we want 100% status quo, you know?
In any given election, there's always going to be a group of people who think things are not going well.
Yeah.
I think it's us this year.
Right. I think it's the other side. So that's why I'm confused. Like, what does Dr. Jim Maxwell see that he wants change? And I'm not sure I got that from watching the debate that happened earlier this week, sponsored by local news organizations.
Yeah, definitely. I felt the same way.
Some of his major policy proposals include, though. So here's some of the changes perhaps that he'd want to see. He really wants to clean up government corruption. Of course, Albany is notoriously corrupt, but also on the federal level, he claims that he wants to clean up government corruption. He wants to institute term limits on Congress people. So as of now, there's no term limits on Congress people or senators. Yeah. Senators can serve for the rest of their lives as long as they're reelected, and same with people in the House of Reps. And so he, along with a number of other conservative candidates like Shel Farley, who's running in the Senate seat against Kirsten Gillibrand, the incumbent Democrat, are both arguing for term limits. And maybe even Mark Molinaro, who's running against Andrew Cuomo in the governor's seat. It's an interesting policy position. I've never really heard Democrats argue for it that much, for term limits. And honestly, I'd be interested in looking into that more. And hearing from you too, listeners, like should politicians have term limits? We have it on the presidency. The president can only serve 2 terms, and that was instituted after FDR, right?
What about judges?
Yeah, what about judges? Yeah, they can serve their whole life, but we have talked about that too on this show before. So Dr. Jim Maxwell wants to clean up corruption. He wants to institute term limits, and he's big on fighting the opioid epidemic. Of course, as a doctor, that seems to be, medicine is a big part of his platform, and the opioid epidemic is something he likes to talk about. And of course, as a conservative, here comes the mainstream argument, is he wants to make New York State more business friendly. He wants to reduce taxes, and he wants to deregulate the business field to make, there's more business friendly environment. That is kind of the typical conservative platform.
A more corporate friendly environment, perhaps.
Yeah. But interestingly, Maxwell is not running as a Trumpian candidate. There's a number of candidates around the country who are running as Donald Trump. And in fact, the Republican Party seems to be becoming the party of Donald Trump. The Republican Party is quickly vanishing, and what used to be old conservatism, Reagan conservatism, Bush conservatism, etc., is harder and harder to see, in my opinion. And it's interesting that Dr. Jim Maxwell is not running as a Trumpian candidate. I don't think he invoked Trump's name at all during the debate. No. I don't think he invokes it on his website and his policy issues. He's separating, and that's very noteworthy because a number of candidates who are running for similar seats as he in the House of Reps are talking directly about Donald Trump and promoting Donald Trump as the person on the ballot, metaphorically so.
And he differs from Donald Trump in at least a few of his stances, such as climate change, for example. He believes that climate change is happening and is being caused by human activity. And I'm not sure what Donald Trump's thoughts are on legalizing cannabis, but Dr. Jim Maxwell is also in favor of that.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, and while all of Maxwell's policies fall on the conservative side of the spectrum, they are traditionally, they're not Trumpian conservative, and they tend to be more moderate. They, again, he believes in climate change, although his response to it is still arguably too slow to save the planet, as, argued by scientists and other, most other people. And he's also in favor, I think, of some gun regulation. He's interested in looking into how we can make it so that less people have to end up in his operating table, so to speak. And so, as a candidate, Dr. Jim Maxwell he's a conservative, but, he's definitely not the Trumpian conservative and differs a lot from that establishment figure of Donald Trump. Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit about Joe Morelle? Who is he and what does he stand for?
Sure. So Joe Morelle is currently the assembly leader of New York State. He is a Democrat. He has been involved in politics since the early 90s, I believe. So he is, I guess, what you would term a career politician. He's very poised on the stage. You could tell that he knows what he's doing, that he's prepared. In his opening statement, he definitely positioned himself as an anti-Trump candidate. I wrote down what I felt was like the heart of his opening statement, which was this: I believe this is the most important midterm election in our nation's history. I think we have choices to make about the path we choose. We can go down the path that has been led by our president with his incendiary comments, his seeking to divide the country, and his decision to talk to the media as though they're the enemy of the people, and to talk about political adversaries as evil. This type of incivility, this type of division, I don't think this is the America we want. It's certainly not the America that I want. And yet, after he said that, almost in the same breath, he touted his own record as one of bipartisanship, and he sort of all but pledged to make an effort to work across the aisle, which I found sort of interesting, because he first framed the discussion as one of opposition, and then sort of turned that around and said, "Make no mistake, I plan to be cooperative." And I guess we'll get into this later as we go through the questions, but I didn't really see that effort to be bipartisan in really any of the policy or stances that he took during the debate.
Well, I think it's much harder to be a liberal than a conservative at this moment, perhaps. So for conservatives, it's much easier, I think, to go behind Donald Trump, because that's where the momentum is with the Republican base. If you are a Republican or a conservative and you just say, I am 100% for Donald Trump, you are better off saying that than you are criticizing Donald Trump. We've seen that with Jeff Flake. We've seen that with other individuals who criticize Donald Trump and then have to not run for office or lose their seat. And so I think as a liberal, as a Democrat, you're in a more awkward position. Do you take that hardline stance and say, look, we are not working with Donald Trump because this administration is an obscenity? Or do you have to come up with some sort of bipartisan or cordial affect and try to come off as saying, look, we'll still have to get things done. We have to be productive, and we'll have to work across the aisle.
Yeah.
And I think that liberals are stuck in that hard position there because their base is split too, right? Half the base, I think, wants to see liberals take a much stronger stance, do not take anything from this administration, while the other half says, I mean, we have to do something, don't go too far to the left. And Morelle, I think, is is not going too far to the left.
Yes, he does seem to be more, I don't want to call him a centrist, but he is more center-left than certainly many of his opponents in the primary are, or were. One more thing I wanted to add was, but I've lost my train of thought.
It's because you're wearing matching red and red today.
Yeah,
it's blinding.
It's messing with my equilibrium. We'll come back to it if I remember it.
Yeah, so those are the two candidates. Listeners, if you're just tuning in, this is 100.9 FM WXIR here in Rochester, New York. Thanks for being here and listening. We want to hear from you today on this program. This program is nothing without your support. You can give us a call, 585-219-8889. Are you going to vote this coming November 6th? Are you even registered to vote? Do you know about the two candidates who are running for the 25th Congressional District? Do you know about the candidates who are running for governor, for senator? Any of the candidates, let us know. We want to talk to you. We want to hear from you about your perspective on the upcoming midterms, which affects us all, whether or not you are traditionally, as you would define, engaged in politics or not. We want to hear from you. This is your chance. If you've never called into a radio program before, it can be kind of scary, but give it a shot. We don't bite, at least not through the airwaves or anything. So give us a call, 585-219-8889. We want to hear from you. Share your voice. This is fundamentally about us and you.
So I did remember just now what the last thing I wanted to add, which was the difficulty in being a Democrat, at least, and extending an olive branch, so to speak, across the aisle and being bipartisan, is that at least in the case of Donald Trump, the president, you're not going to be seeing the same sort of you're not going to see that reciprocity. I wouldn't necessarily say the same for the Republican Party, but I mean, we only have to look at the president's Twitter feed to see that he views this race as, in terms of like an all or nothing sort of game that needs to be won.
It's a brinkmanship, yeah. Well, that goes to something that we talked about last week, Matt, when we were talking about the terrible terrorist incident in Norway in 2011 with the individual who took so many lives on an island and killed children. And we were talking about how society should respond to individuals who commit such horrible acts of terror and violence. And I think you said, Matt, like the problem is, as a society and how we respond, do we extend that person an olive branch, such as, do we engage with neo-Nazis, or do we just have to have a hardline stance because they won't show the same back to you?
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting and unanswered question that is up for debate. And the Democrats are struggling with that right now, self-proclaimed liberals, I think, the entire party. But let's jump into some of the issues. One of our favorite things to talk about is, of course, capitalism, that whole institution, that thing.
I think that you were probably very excited when this was the first question that was asked, and then you were probably very disappointed when they spent maybe 2 minutes talking about it.
Yeah, the first 60 seconds of the debate, and we're talking about the debate that was sponsored by local media organizations such as WXXI and 13 Wham. You can find it online if you YouTube the Voice of the Voter debate, 25th of October, which is the Dr. Jim Maxwell versus Joe Morelle. The first question that was asked was, are you skeptical of capitalism, and do you want to see the country move towards socialism?
Yeah.
And I was pretty giddy with excitement because I was like, this is what this is about, right? This is the point of this radio show, is to talk about economic inequality and to critique capitalism and some of the structures of it, because they're so normatively absorbed that we don't talk about capitalism in everyday vernacular and everyday lingo. It's just not something in the language.
Yeah, I think Evan Dawson even shared a statistic that said something like only 48% of millennials, people Jason and I's age, have a favorable view of capitalism, and that socialism is taking a much more is being looked on much more favorably by our generation, at least.
Absolutely, but neither Dr. Jim Maxwell nor Joe Morelle are members of our generation. Matt, what did Joe Morelle have to say about his view on capitalism?
It's the best thing. It's the best economic system ever created, basically. He was certainly much more critical of it. Well, I don't know if he was much more critical, but he was critical of capitalism, and he said capitalism in its purest form leaves disparities. He didn't necessarily talk too much about what those disparities are, but as someone who has positioned himself as being for women's rights and supportive of people of color, I assume that he was talking about things like wealth inequality and the wage gap and things of that nature, as well as like how deregulating big business can leave workers behind, which is something that he brought up later when they were asked about the last Republican tax bill that was passed last year.
Yeah, and so Joe Morelle, the Democratic candidate, is saying, look, capitalism is the best system. However, we shouldn't have free market, completely laissez-faire, hands-off capitalism. We need some regulation to rein in capitalism's worst excesses. And I think that is the mainstream Democratic platform. It has been for a while. Nancy Pelosi, right after the 2016 election, famously was caught in a debate or a town hall, and a young college student or a young individual asked her, what about socialism? And she's like, no, it is the policy of the Democratic Party that capitalism is what we are.
This is America.
This is America, right, going off on all of that.
Yeah.
And so, capitalism is and always has been America, and very much so, although there's different manifestations of capitalism, but that's a very different story. But long story short is that the mainstream establishment, of course, in this country is that free market, individualistic, entrepreneurship, capitalism with private ownership and the means of production is how this society is run. And that is the platform of both candidates. Dr. Jim Maxwell said, as a quote, "I believe in capitalism. It's the best economic engine this world has seen. I think capitalism produces wealth and shares it appropriately." I definitely think capitalism produces wealth. I don't think it shares it appropriately.
No.
But I think that's where Morelle would disagree. Where, look, yes, capitalism produces things, but we could have some regulation on the government side of things to rein in the worst excesses and share the load, as one would say.
But as you said, there are so many variations and permutations of all of these economic theories, and so it's very difficult to know exactly where either of them stand without having a very, I think, long and nuanced discussion.
Right. not something that gets in 60-second sound bites. But
Right.
interestingly, Dr. Jim Maxwell did say that socialism could be used in healthcare and Social Security as examples. He said that the government could use socialism in some cases, and I think it's just interesting to hear a conservative say that.
Definitely.
And
I was surprised by that.
Yeah, and that's why I think he's much more moderate than the conservative base and establishment conservative candidates today. You know, he is no Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell. Just to hear a conservative say that is pretty shocking to me, and you know, I at least appreciate it from where my own political views stand. But otherwise, he said that capitalism is the best system this world has known, and perhaps he's not wrong. You know, I always struggle with this question. It's like, if you take a very big view of world history and you compare capitalism to mercantilism or feudalism or just like slavery systems, you know, yeah, capitalism is pretty great, you know, comparatively. But the point is that doesn't mean that you don't work to change it. And obviously there's so many problems in modern society as a cause of capitalism, such as rampant income and wealth inequality, that we need to be critiquing that and keep moving to a better system. Whether or not it's full-fledged socialism is not the point. The point is, let's make capitalism work for everyone, particularly the billions of people who are left behind on a daily basis as I'm talking by the system.
Or just make it work. It doesn't have to be capitalism. It doesn't have to be socialism. It can be called whatever you want to call it. Just devise a system that feels engendered to making a fair and balanced system where the most number of people can succeed and live comfortably, if not, you know, lavishly.
Do you want to be the one to draft that, Matt?
I'd rather not.
Rather not, yeah, it's tough. So what about healthcare? Healthcare is a big topic in this election. The polls used to say, I think a year ago, that the biggest thing on voters' minds this election would have been the Republican tax cuts that came out at the end of 2016, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But that quickly, well, I don't know if it shifted, but I think from the news reports I read, journalists were surprised at how much healthcare was on voters' minds.
I believe it's like in the top three issues that people are considering for this election.
Definitely. It is top 3, and it's not something you hear on the news every day. It's not that big budget issues that's, you know, on the front page of organizations such as immigration or the opioid crisis, perhaps. But
the last time I feel that there was any sort of like sustained attention given towards healthcare was when Trump's administration was trying to get rid of Obamacare.
Yes, when they were trying to repeal and replace. That was the Republican line ever since the Affordable Care Act. Yes, ever since 2010, it's been repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. We do not like the individual mandate. We do not like the fact that the government can force people, well, under threat of taxation, to buy health insurance.
Right.
We do not like the fact that the government has a say in health care, so we need to repeal and replace the system. The Republicans have never come out with a well-articulated replace. They're very good at saying repeal, but there's never a replace. And, of course, that was famously shut down by the late John McCain and a few other Republican senators who voted against the Republicans' efforts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. I forgot the name of the specific legislation, but the individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act is essentially null and void right now. To my knowledge, there is no tax penalty on Americans who do not get health insurance. And so essentially the Affordable Care Act has no teeth anymore.
Yeah.
And of course, the healthcare system is still widely broken. Many Americans face high premiums and a lack of coverage. So there's both a coverage and a cost issue. And there's not many people out there articulating clear solutions. Besides, I think the far left, with Medicare for all, with universal health care, with a single-payer system, that's at least the only well-articulated system out there. What did Joe Morelle have to say about Medicare for all, Matt?
Yeah, real quick, I just want to give everybody a refresher that Medicare is a federal program that provides health coverage if you are 65 or older and have a disability or have a severe disability, no matter your income. Medicare and Medicaid are often confused because they're very similar words. Medicaid is a state and federal program that provides health coverage if you have a very low income. So remember that Medicare is federal only, Medicaid is state and federal. Medicare is geared towards typically senior citizens and people with severe disabilities. It has no income is not a factor, whereas Medicaid is geared specifically towards people with a very low income. So right out of the gate, Joe Morelle said something like, "I believe healthcare is a right for all Americans." Mm-hmm. So that's that's fairly typical of Democratic candidates these days. He mentioned disparities in affordability and quality of care for people of color versus white people and for young versus old people. He said that we need to protect people who have pre-existing conditions and that this is something that's in danger under the Trump administration. He called for an end to all lifetime caps, which are basically things like, apparently under Medicare right now, under a lot of Medicare plans, you're only guaranteed like, I think, a year's worth of hospital days. And once those are up, Medicare won't pay for hospital stays anymore. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that was what I gleaned from the research that I did. He said that we need to ensure all people have coverage, especially young people who might not opt in because they feel like they don't need to because they're young and healthy. He stressed that his Medicare for All solution is not a single-payer option, which is something he brought up in the last primary debate, actually. And he cited Medicare Parts B, C, and D use insurance companies that do claims payment and that make sure that there are different options for people based on what situations they have. Now, I didn't actually know about this, but Medicare is apparently broken up into 4 parts called A, B, C, and D. And those are differentiated by things like, if you have Medicare Part A, for example, that's for, it manages and provides benefits and coverage for things like inpatient hospital care and hospice and home health services, whereas Medicare Part B is geared towards covering things like doctor and clinical lab services, outpatient and preventative care, home health care, screening, surgical fees and supplies, physical and occupational therapy. So I wasn't able to glean whether or not if you have Medicare, you have all of these working in tandem. I believe that different Medicare plans incorporate different aspects of these parts, essentially. And Medicare Part A is single payer, but as Joe Morelle said, B, C, and D are not. They use other insurance companies to help cover costs.
So Joe Morelle is saying, look, we want Medicare for all, but we don't want a single-payer healthcare, or it doesn't necessarily need to be a single-payer healthcare system.
He does not support it. I believe in the last primary debate, he said something like the difficulty in getting single-payer is that, at least on the state level, he doesn't feel like it can be done.
Right.
It needs federal backing, and you're not going to see that with Trump as president.
Yeah, and listeners, if you have listened to our show before, you might have caught when we interviewed Robin Wilt, who was in the primary debate against Joe Morelle, and of course, other candidates were traditionally more liberal and progressive than Joe Morelle, and they favored systems such as single-payer healthcare, and Joe Morelle differed from those individuals, saying he wasn't in favor of a single-payer system.
And I think that is also incumbent Governor Cuomo's position as well, that he believes it needs federal backing.
Yeah. And so healthcare is wildly complicated. I don't understand completely Medicare for all, universal healthcare, single-payer system. They're different words that need to be defined. Dr. Jim Maxwell, though, however, does not think Medicare for all is good. He does not think the government should run the healthcare system. He provides the failures of the VA, the administration, the arm of the government that helps Veterans Affairs. He says, look at the VA that's not doing so well to care for veterans. The government is not capable of providing health care for hundreds of millions of Americans. And he says the problem in healthcare is cost, not coverage. We know that around 20% or less, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, less than 20% of Americans, in that range, 10 to 20%, do not have health insurance. And so I'm not sure how you can say the problem is cost, not coverage, when a sizable chunk of Americans do not have health care. But he says we need to get healthcare costs down. That is the biggest problem. And how do we do that? We do that through competition.
Yeah, he stressed that.
Yep, competition. It's the traditional capitalist or Republican line where you need a free and open market, and competition somehow magically solves the system. I'm personally confused by that because we've had a competitive healthcare system for a while. Arguably, perhaps you could say the government could do things to make it more competitive. But I think Morelle countered him, saying, look, we've had this system and it's not working. We have competition, it's not working.
Yeah, one of the things Jim Maxwell brought up as a concern for embracing a more public option was that he wondered, where's the money going to come from? Mm-hmm. He said either it's going to come from higher taxes or it's going to come from raising the national debt. And Morelle kind of countered by saying that we already pay trillions, he said. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's true or not, but
yeah,
it's probably
it is. Yeah.
He said we pay trillions in healthcare premiums already, and the way he phrased it, he didn't outright say it, but he seemed to suggest that a lot of that money that's already spent on premiums would instead be spent on Medicare for all if it became available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I tend to agree with that. Again, I'm not well articulated enough about the healthcare system to know what we do about it.
Right.
I just do think that the excuse of like where's the money going to come from is really just not intellectually rigorous enough when the Republicans just passed a massive tax cut that has failed to stimulate the economy. So whenever Republicans talk about fiscal responsibility anymore, I just don't buy it at all because, I'm getting too off on a tangent here, but it doesn't make sense. Like the argument of how are we going to pay for something doesn't make sense when the government invents what money is to begin with. It's like, how are we going to pay for it? I don't know. Like, you're the one who makes money,
Yeah.
So I know that's a really silly argument, and it goes back to like, we'll just make the world better. But the point is like,
which is that comes up later.
There are solutions out there, and just saying we can't pay for this, we can't pay for healthcare for each individual American is not the right answer when you're a politician who's representing each individual American.
Yeah, you should have a plan.
You should have a plan. This is your job.
Yeah.
And just to say, let the free market decide, well...
Why are you and I figuring this out right now?
Right, why are we figuring this out? I'm not sure. But listeners, maybe you're figuring this out too. And today on Evidence of Design, Matt and I are talking about the candidates for the 25th Congressional District. That is the seat in the House of Representatives previously held by Louis Slaughter, who passed away earlier this year. The candidates on the November 6th ballot are Dr. Joe Morelle versus Dr. Jim Maxwell. Both are Monroe County residents. Joe Morelle is the Democratic candidate and historically the leader of the New York State Assembly. And Dr. Jim Maxwell is a doctor, and he is running as a Republican. And we're talking today mainly, using research from the candidates' issues and page and news articles, but also from a debate that was aired this week on the 25th of October from local media organizations called the Voice of the Voter debate between Dr. Jim Maxwell and Joe Morelle. You can find that online. And we want you to be a part of this discussion. We want to hear from you about these two candidates. Are you in favor of one over the other? Are you unhappy with both? If you've never called into a radio program before, it's easy and simple, and you can do it at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. So we've talked about how the candidates perceive capitalism. We've talked about how the candidates view healthcare. Joe Morelle thinks that capitalism is the best economic system, just like Dr. Jim Maxwell. However, Morelle would say that capitalism could have some of its worst excesses reined in, i.e. government regulation.
Yes.
And we've talked about how the candidates have differed with healthcare in that Joe Morelle approves Medicare for all, but Dr. Jim Maxwell does not and thinks that the government should stay out of healthcare.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about guns, shall we?
Let's do it. This is where I think things started to fall apart a bit.
This is where it goes crazy now. So why did it fall apart, Matt?
I'll get to that. So I guess I'll just start with what Joe Morelle had to say. I believe the question was like something to do with, we've seen a lot of tragedies in the past few years involving guns and what is your stance on gun legislation. And he began by sort of touting his own record, saying that in his early days at office, he helped pass.
Yeah. His very first day, the SAFE Act passed.
Well, yes, his very first day as New York State Assembly leader, they passed the SAFE Act, which is one of the most comprehensive. It is one of like the strongest gun laws in the country. It's not just one law; it's a list of legislation. But anyway,
right. He
also said that early on, even before he was State Assembly leader, he helped pass a military-style assault weapon ban in New York State. He called for better universal background checks. He said they currently don't go far enough. A direct quote, he said, right now, if someone, I actually paraphrase this, right now, if someone on the prohibited list applies and doesn't get a response in 3 days, they'll get a license whether they should or not. And something he said that, it's kind of like a buzz phrase, but I appreciate it. He says that all rights carry responsibilities. He said he would endorse a ban on military-style assault weapons, and that he would ban things like bump stocks and other modifications. So I guess I appreciated the stance he took. Of course, I think if anybody who's been listening to the show for a long time will know that I'm pretty anti-gun myself. But as someone who's done like a minimal amount of research on the whole thing, I was kind of dissatisfied with Morelle continuing to bring up military-style assault weapons. We've talked on the show before about how the term assault weapon is legally amorphous.
Mm-hmm.
It's different in every state, so it's not exactly something that has a well-defined definition. Guns that have a military appearance don't necessarily have military weapon capabilities. However, many of them can be easily modified in order to have them. And as we've also brought up on the show, most gun crimes, a large majority, are not even committed with quote-unquote assault weapons, but with handguns. And so I think whenever someone brings up the need to ban assault weapons, it's kind of like... And I don't know that this was necessarily Joe Morelle's intent, but I think the end result is that it distracts and it takes away from a more nuanced conversation that we need to be having on the realities of gun violence. And I was a little disappointed to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Personally.
I agree with you overall, Matt, but I do appreciate how Morelle brought up the NICS, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. Yes. And that's something that you mentioned that he said, where it's like, we need to change the fact that if you try to buy a gun and it goes to the FBI and they run a criminal background check on you, if the FBI, for whatever reason, does not complete that background check within 3 days, you are automatically cleared. You automatically are able to buy a gun if the background check is not completed. And we've talked about that before on our very first few shows on Evidence of Design. I think it was our second and third shows that came right after the shooting in Parkland, Florida at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, where the NICS system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, could be changed. And that's where I think you're getting to your point, where it's like, we need to talk about the gun debate in more nuanced ways beyond just saying Second Amendment and military-style assault weapons.
Yeah.
You know, the same way that with our healthcare debate, like, I don't know what Medicare for all, single-payer, universal healthcare, you know, I need to look into those as a voter. It's my responsibility to understand, but it's also the responsibility of those in power to clearly articulate and make us aware of those things, too. But largely I agree that the debate is unhelpful when you just get to, like, using buzzwords.
And I did harp on that a little bit. In Joe Morelle's defense, he only brought up the term military-style assault weapons 2 times. And I was gladdened to see, as you said, him devote some time to talking about background checks, because I feel like that is probably the best line of defense.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to Dr. Jim Maxwell, Matt.
Let's turn to this dumpster fire.
No, come on. So Dr. Jim Maxwell says that the Second Amendment is on a pedestal and
it's an unequivocal,
sacrosanct,
inalienable right.
Right. Yeah. So the Second Amendment is the right to own a gun, not a privilege to own a gun. He literally says, though, that he removes bullets from the skulls of hundreds of people on the operating table. Oh my God, this is terrible.
Adam McFadden.
Yes.
It's the only person on stage who has had the pleasure of being shot.
Yeah, it's God. It's hard talking about these issues, gun violence. It affects so many people that it's hard to talk about them because it's really saddening. And
disturbing.
It's disturbing. Yeah, it's just quite disturbing to me, and it makes me sad. But so here's a doctor who says that he helps victims of gun violence all the time, and says still that the Second Amendment is sacrosanct and that it's a right, not a privilege, and that to legislate guns, we shouldn't legislate an inanimate object. It's the old NRA argument where guns don't kill people, people kill people. Guns aren't the problem, bad people are the problem.
Yeah.
We have to stop bad people. Dr. Jim Maxwell turned to the West Webster incident a few years ago, where unfortunately 2 local firefighters were tragically murdered responding on Christmas Eve to an arson in Webster.
A 911 call.
Yeah, a 911 call. And, he brought up that individual couldn't legally buy a gun, but he had a neighbor buy one for him, and so you can't legislate that away, right? So anytime you have legislation, it just punishes law-abiding citizens.
Yeah. And then he said something like, I believe there is a way to anticipate when these crimes will happen and who will commit them. But he didn't give, any reason... Or he didn't give an explanation of how that would happen, and I feel like the easiest and most effective way to do that is with background checks, which is something that Joe Morelle called him out on. He's like, that's how you do it.
Yeah. I just think we need to get to a place in the debate where you can restrict the ease of buying guns without restricting the right of buying the guns. Just because you want to restrict someone's ease of buying a gun does not mean that you want to take away someone's Second Amendment right. It just means that you want a more thorough and nuanced process.
Yeah. I also want to point out that in Morelle's first rebuttal of Jim Maxwell's point, he said, in New York State, we allow New York State mental health professionals to revoke a patient's gun license if they are believed to be a danger to themselves or to others. And Dr. Jim Maxwell just seized upon that and took a full minute to talk about how he stands up for mental health.
Yes.
People who suffer from mental health and that they have been long stigmatized as perpetrators of violence, which they have been. But in the context of what Joe Morelle was saying, it just kind of seemed like a straw man's argument.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't at all what... I mean, Joe Morelle specifically said, if someone is believed to be a danger to themselves or to others, we have given... It's illegal in New York State for a mental health professional to revoke their gun license.
Right.
Which I don't think is something that anybody should disagree with,
mm-hmm.
or would disagree with. It seems like pretty sensible legislation to me.
And doesn't that counter Dr. Jim Maxwell's own argument? So Dr. Jim Maxwell is saying, look, we shouldn't legislate guns. We should try somehow through law enforcement or some other way to stop bad people from doing bad things. But then he comes out and says we shouldn't stigmatize the mentally ill, which we shouldn't. But the fact is the only way to do that, I think, is to stigmatize the mentally ill. If you want to stop bad people from doing bad things, I think that using his argument, the only way to do that would be to stop and frisk, so-called, to do a caricature of each individual and say, oh, this person looks mentally ill to me, they shouldn't be able to buy a gun. So it's just weird to hear him defend the mentally ill, which I think is great because you should, and that's right.
Absolutely.
But it's not consonant with whatever policy proposal he wants to actually do.
Yeah, I mean, the impression that I got from him was that this just wasn't something that he had thought through. His whole stance on the thing seemed to be contradictory in parts.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the point of the debate, where if you support Second Amendment rights because you like to say the word Second Amendment, I don't think you have an argument. You're just saying this is worth more than the lives of children and people who die by guns every single day.
Yeah.
And, well, that's my opinion on the debate. But listeners, if you were just tuning in, this is 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester, and thanks for being here. You can let us know, what are your thoughts and opinions on the two candidates running for the 25th Congressional District? What do you think of Dr. Dr. Jim Maxwell or Joe Morelle? Both of these candidates are pretty centrist in the grand scheme of things. Neither candidate is, socialist. Neither candidate is in the Bernie Sanders camp, but neither candidate is in the Trump camp. Do you want to see more Trumpian politics around Monroe County? Do you want to see more socialist progressive politics around Monroe County? What do you think? We want to hear from you. 585-219-8889. 585-219-8889. Matt, let me throw down and talk about what the candidates thought about schools.
I imagine you have much to say about this.
Oh, lordy, as...
Do you want me to go quickly?
Because
I have 2 points to make.
Oh, Matt, what did Joe Morelle say about how we improve schools in Monroe County, specifically the Rochester City School District?
He said governance is not the issue. Poverty is. And he also said that he had been working on the past 18 months on a system that was designed to integrate health, human service, and education systems together because he believes that is necessary in order to assist especially impoverished families living in urban areas of Rochester. Yeah.
Yes. So Joe Morelle is saying, look, it's not about governance. It's not about school boards or charter schools or old schools or new schools. It is about really the system's poverties. It's about poverty. It's about the social system.
Yes.
And he says we need an integrated system of support that helps out students.
Yeah.
Dr. Jim Maxwell is on the other side of the fence. He's off the ballpark. He is in the lake. He is talking about the fact that, schools don't need more money. They need better governance. If you put out a bad product year after year, the problem with schools is bad governance. And he says, this is almost a direct quote, I think, that too often we blame poverty and social deprivation on poor schools. And he says poverty and social deprivation are not the main problems. It's the governance of schools.
I mean, I think obviously Joe Morelle's stance appeals to me, but I do think that there are times when we use poverty as an excuse too often. We too often, I think, frame the lives of these people through the lens of poverty and think that this is the reason why everything are. But there are so many other factors going on, such as institutional racism and sexism as well. And, well, I imagine that you have a much more nuanced perspective on this, Jason, being somebody who works in education.
Yeah. So the problem in education, one of the problems in education that is supported by lots of research and I think common sense, is that when you have a lot of people who have material precarity, as in they struggle on a daily basis to meet their basic needs, when you have lots of those people in the same building trying to receive an education, the education is compromised because the lack of basic needs on behalf of the children and their families constantly outweighs the need or the ability to receive the attention and care that education provides. If you know anything about Abraham Maslow, it's the most basic thing on a pyramid, saying if you do not have food, clothing, shelter, etc., you cannot care about anything else, such as relationships, self-actualization, etc., 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 building your own capital. I think that's a fairly common sense thing, and I think that it's supported by research, and it is out there to say if you have high concentrated numbers of individuals in poverty in schools, the schools will do poorly. Period. End of story. However, I want to add a caveat that I do not think, so, it's out there that most of the schools in RCSD have 85% of students living in poverty. And there are lots of listeners right now who might fall into that statistic. And I want to be very careful and say that people who would fall into that statistic of being classified as living in poverty might not view themselves as living in poverty. And I think that's fine. I think that when you talk about poverty, it is fairly relative in that some people don't need as much material resources to make their ends be met. And I think that's fine. However, I do think that there is something to be said about the fact that if you are making less than $20,000 a year or something, like that's an issue. And it's not your fault. That is a systemic issue, and that will hurt everything else. And therefore, the problem with education is that we live in a segregated society where the fact is most of the people who live in poverty all attend the same schools because they all tend to live in the same area because of white flight and redlining, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I could go on much longer and with the more attention that needs on a different time, but I just think that this argument that poverty and social deprivation does not affect poor performance in schools is heinous, it is unproductive, and it is patently false. And read the city newspaper, and there are articles written every day from a lot of folks in the suburbs who say, poverty does not affect education. I beg to differ and would argue to the ends of this earth that that is not true. And, it just hurts me to see this candidate say that somehow school governance is the problem and that, there's charter schools that are somehow effective in the city. Well, you know what? There's also city schools that are effective in the city because there's good people there doing hard work. And it just really bugs me. But I'll get off my horse. And sorry for that little rant, but I tend to agree with Morelle there where it's like, yeah, let's try to get an integrated system of supports that helps out students. Because, you know what, blaming teachers or administrators or parents, like, the problem is society, man. The problem is that we allow poverty to exist. Yeah. That's the problem. So,
do you want to jump ahead and talk about the Republican tax plan?
Oh, it's one of my favorite topics right behind education, Matt. Let's talk about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. What did Joe Morelle have to say about the effectiveness of the Republican tax plan that was passed at the end of last year?
Well, he came out and said that the current economic growth owes, quote, virtually nothing to the bill, as we've seen continuous growth for the past 100 months, which is something that Jim Maxwell also brought up. And only about he said 18, but I think it's more like 22 months at this point. Only about 22 of those 100 months Donald Trump has been president for, and the tax bill has only been in place for less than a year. He said 83% of the benefit from those tax cuts went to multimillionaires and billionaires. The average citizen will see their taxes go down briefly before they go back up. He said this was a massive decision. He called it out as a massive decision by the Republican Party to pull the wool over the eyes of the American public. He was not happy about it. He said that the capping of state and local taxes is egregious to this community. This was something that I was not entirely sure about. Hopefully you can enlighten me on that, Jason. And he pledged to work towards repealing much of the bill, and he said that $2 trillion was added to America's deficit as a result of this tax bill.
So Morelle is saying not good.
Yeah, not pro.
Yeah. So as a reminder for listeners, the Republicans have for a long time wanted to cut taxes. You know, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s historically slashed taxes. The top marginal taxation rate was like 90% during World War II, went down to the 70s in the 1960s, and then, you know, in the 80s it went down to kind of, I might botch this, but maybe 40% or 35%. Meaning, so if you're the highest income earners, you'll owe, you know, 40% of your income to taxes. I know that might not be exact. I used to know the numbers. Long story short is our top marginal taxation rate has been around 35% for the past 30 years. You know, Republican or Democrat has stayed around the same. Democrats tend to nudge it up a little bit. And this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has bottomed out, has lowered that top marginal taxation rate, and has condensed the income brackets. Meaning, if you make, let's say, that this isn't true, I don't know the exact number, but let's say if you make $400,000 or more a year, you are in the highest income bracket. That means that, you know, Jeff Bezos versus a doctor could pay the same amount in the highest top marginal taxation rate.
Yeah.
And so the idea is taxation can be used as a tool to not only make the government money, but also to level out income inequality. And so traditionally, conservative and Republican efforts are to get a flat tax line, meaning a flat tax, so everyone, regardless of income, will pay the same amount in taxes because somehow that's fair or whatever. And so this Tax Cut and Jobs Act slash taxes, it was a really big deal. Republicans were super happy about it. And they argue that doing this would, of course, help the economy. It would create jobs. It would boost growth. They argued that the deficits it would provide, because, by the way, government 101 is that the government makes money through taxation. And if you lower taxation, you either have to lower spending or just get debt. We have for a long time just gotten more debt. And this tax plan is giving us trillions of dollars in debt with no way to pay it back because trickle-down economics doesn't work.
Or it works, and it's very literal. It trickles.
Yes, it trickles. Yes, trickles up. And so, long story short, is that, you know, Dr. Jim Maxwell is generally supportive of the tax cut. Again, he says that New York State is an unfriendly business state. We should cut taxes. We should deregulate, and we should just, you know, have less taxes because taxes are bad and takes money from hardworking Americans or something.
Like a very standard Republican perspective.
Yep. He argued that, you know, the tax cuts have allowed more businesses and more jobs to be produced. I don't think that's supported at all.
He brought up salt taxes.
Yes. So let's talk about that a little bit. And I'm unable to articulate this as well as I should.
Okay.
So salt taxes are state and local tax deductions. And states like New York State and California, which have traditionally high levels of taxation rates, we have high taxes, so to speak. Again, I'm not saying that from I'm just saying that, what's the word? Phenomenologically, not from my own, you know, personal view. I think they could be higher, personally. Yeah. But so I don't think we have that high of taxes.
Right.
But a lot of people think we have high taxes. So compared to other states, New York State and California have relatively high taxes, and therefore, there are provisions such as the state and local tax deductions where individuals who, I believe, itemize their taxes can deduct the amount of can deduct the taxes they owe in state and local taxes from their federal taxes, meaning it becomes a deduction, meaning that if you pay a lot of state and local taxes, you don't have to pay a lot of federal taxes. This traditionally only helps very wealthy individuals, those who make like $100,000 or more a year. And so long story short is that Governor Cuomo in New York State and California were very angry at this Tax Cut and Jobs Act because it hurt us. It hurt blue states with high taxations. And a lot of people argue that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was a political assassination against high taxation states. And so now, under that legislation, is that the state and local tax deductions are capped at $10,000, and you can only deduct $10,000 off of your federal taxes if you itemize with state and local tax deductions. That is all I know, and maybe, hopefully, some of that's true. Some of it, just kidding. But, you know, listeners, if you know more, 585-219-8889. But, you know, that has historically been bad. Interestingly, both Maxwell and Morelle are against the salt taxes and the tax plan.
Yes.
And I think that's across the board. Republicans in New York State are against that too.
So there's so much more to talk about, but we've only got 4 minutes left, and I feel like I want to hit you with a bit of a curveball, Jason.
I'm scared.
So I wrote this down last night after watching the debate, and it was something, these are just feelings that I feel like I want to express on this show, and I feel are in need of of some kind of level of broadcasting. So here I go. Joe Morelle and Jim Maxwell both made claims that they would strive to end the bitter bipartisanship that divides the country and the government in their closing statements. But they both also took strong stances against the policies of each other's parties throughout the debate. It's difficult for me to imagine either of them playing a significant role in bridging this divide because it continues to deepen in my own community every day. I know many people who have deleted friends on Facebook and other social media sites because of arguments or viewpoints that their friends have expressed. And while I don't think it's the responsibility of anyone to put up with toxic individuals, I do worry about our ability to create private echo chambers through the media we consume and the friends we retain. I myself am as guilty of this as anyone. While watching the debate, I felt a familiar pull to deride much of what Dr. Maxwell had to say. At points, I had to re-examine myself and ask if my condescension was focused on the substance of his arguments or his status as the member of a party I have come to distrust. And I feel the answer is that I simply don't see the value in most, if any, of what the modern Republican Party stands for. I can give several reasons as to why I feel that way, but I don't want to get into it today. What I want to express is that I am afraid. I fear for the breakdown of communication and for what is to follow. I am afraid that events like the ones we saw this week, where multiple homemade bombs were mailed to individuals with strong ties to the Democratic Party, will only multiply in frequency. It's not something that I frankly want to have anything to do with, but as a citizen, I feel responsible for the state we find ourselves in. It's why I plan to vote in next month's election, not just to support my desired vision for the country, but to support the process that enables that vision to renew itself without war or insurrection.
Thanks, Matt. I agree, and I know I was a little condescending throughout this show, and I do want to generally take a moment and hit a pause and say that I applaud the races that Maxwell and Morelle have run. They did not interrupt each other throughout the debate at all. There's very little attack against each other.
They're very civil.
Yeah, and honestly, my own biases, I wanted to not like everything Maxwell said. I want everything that he said, I wanted to find a way to hate it, and that's terrible, But I thankfully, after watching, and this is the whole point of becoming engaged in politics and having an open mind, is I have pretty deep respect for Dr. Jim Maxwell and his positions, because I can see where he's coming from. I don't agree with them, but I respect them. I'm not sure I'm there with Trumpian candidates, but
yeah,
I'm glad to see this kind of debate happening, and hopefully listeners too, you become part of this and think and vote as well. So that's where we're at, and we need to, everything you said, Matt, I think we need to have an open mind as much as we can and just talk about it. So, listeners, thanks for tuning in to Evidence of Design today. The election is November 6th. Up next, we got Craig in the studio right now on the Esquire Hour. He is up next. They put on an awesome show, so please stay tuned for that. Listeners, we'll be back next week on Evidence of Design. We really appreciate you being here. My name is Jason Taylor, your host, joined by my good friend and co-host, Matt Treadwell.
Goodbye.
Be well, be safe, stay engaged, and bye-bye.